Hey, it's Elise Pickett with the Urban Harvest, and today we are going to go over one of the most common mistakes people make when planting their tomato starts. So tomatoes are a really interesting crop. It's one of the things that most people struggle with here in Florida, and it doesn't have to be that way as long as you don't fight the seasons. That's the key, planting at the appropriate time. If you follow the link down below, I do have a link to our free What to Plant When guide, so make sure to check that out so you make sure you're planting in the correct season. But once you've got that down, there's a few other things that people may struggle with or may not know when planting tomatoes. The first thing, they like quality soil. So you need to make sure you have a nice humusy soil, good quality soil. Compost is best, and make sure it has lots of fertilizer in it. They do use a lot of nutrients, and if they don't have what they need, you'll have very low fruit set and low productivity. Another thing I see a lot of people do is not plant them appropriately. And tomatoes are incredibly productive once they get growing, and they're so productive that the top of the plant gets top heavy. If you don't have a solid root base, the plants are going to struggle, they won't get as much nutrients, and they can literally pull themselves out of the ground if they're not properly supported. So in order to help the plant as best as possible, you want to make sure that it's well rooted. And to do that, tomatoes are really interesting. So they can actually root up the entire length of the stem. So most vegetable plants you would plant at the base, right? Down here. You would tuck it into the soil so it's just above where the root line already is. Well, with tomatoes, that is not what you do. You want to plant them as deep as possible. So you see here I have one lower leaf here and then a couple more up here. I want to plant the tomato literally up to that first leaf and maybe even snap that leaf off and go all the way up to this portion here. And by doing so, you will literally have roots grow along the entire length of the stem. So instead of it just having roots from here, you now have, 6 inches of roots going, instead of just that 1 inch at the bottom. Very, very important to make sure you do this correctly. So these tomato starts have been slowly hardened off, I guess you could say. And so basically what that means is over the past couple of weeks, I've slowly been bringing them from the shade that they were germinated in out into the full sun. So if you start your tomatoes from seed and go from the protected, sheltered, probably greenhouse or back porch that you were growing them on and go and plant them directly into your garden, they will freak out. They'll wilt, they may or may not die depending on how much water and how quickly you get to them, but they are not going to be happy campers. It's almost like sending them into a little bit of a shock. So if you take your time with it and know that they're getting close to ready to plant into the bed, and you slowly start moving them out to more and more sun every couple of days, they won't get that transplant shock. So you might move them from the back of the porch to the edge where they start getting a little bit of that filtered light. Then you might go stick them under a shady tree that's near the garden where they'll get a little bit more light throughout the day, but they're still mostly shaded. And then you might set them next to the fence line where the garden is so that they get a little bit of shelter in the afternoon sun, say, and then you want to transplant them into the garden. If you don't take that slow approach, it definitely can lead to a little bit of a shock for the tomato. Watering is very important. That's the next thing you need to concern yourself. So this soil that I'm working with here is nice and moist and crumbly already. So I don't have to worry about the soil being too dry and having that kind of transplant shock as well. So I can plant directly into this. But if your soil were more dry, it might be beneficial to either wait until evening to plant or to water the beds real well and then plant again the next day. Because if we're taking it from this nice, happy, environment where it's getting watered regularly in the container and putting it into a bed that is dry, it's again going to shock the plant. The soil that's around the plant when you plant it is actually going to draw what little moisture was in the soil you put in with the tomato away, so it's going to dry out really fast. So that's another thing to consider when planting into the garden. In general, tomatoes need space. They don't want to be crowded or have competition from the other plants in the area. But at the same time, I'm not willing to rip out this bed yet. Clearly there's some stuff that's going to seed that can go ahead and get removed from the bed, but I also have plants that are still perfectly viable and putting out good tatsoi and greens. By the time the tomatoes get really big, these greens will be spent. So what I'm gonna do is actually interplant into the greens for right now so that I can get the harvest of the greens as long as possible. By the time the tomatoes start to fill out and bush out and need the extra space, the greens will be ready to yank and I'll have used the bed to the maximum production. Like I said, I'm a diversity freak, so if you have any varieties of tomatoes that you found grow well here in Florida, please leave a comment below. I always love trying new varieties. And if you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button with the little bell next to it so you're alerted every time a new video comes out. And I can't wait for those tomatoes to get growing.